There's this one sentence in the Bible, tucked away in the book of Romans, that has been tripping people up for centuries. It sounds like this rock-solid promise from God. But what on earth does it actually mean? Well, today, we're going to put on our detective hats and piece together the clues to solve this ancient mystery.
And here it is. This is the heart of the mystery. It's short, it's powerful, and man, it sounds like a crystal clear promise. But here's the thing. On the surface, it creates this huge theological problem, which of course leads to the big question.
What are we even talking about here? What does all Israel mean? And what is this way they're all going to be saved? Now, to solve this, we can't just pluck this one verse out of the air. Nope. We're going to follow the author, the Apostle Paul, on this 3-chapter-long argument he builds that leads right to this one sentence. It's kind of like a detective story, and this verse is the final, shocking reveal.
All right, so our investigation kicks off by trying to understand the problem Paul himself was trying to solve. You see, he wasn't just making some random statement. He was wrestling with this really personal, really painful problem in his own life and ministry.
See, to get what Paul is saying, you got to feel what he was feeling. He knew all the Old Testament promises by heart. The Messiah is going to come, and he's going to save Israel. But the reality he was living was painful. Jesus, the Messiah, had come, and the overwhelming majority of his own people, the Jewish people, were saying no thanks. And this wasn't just a personal bummer for him. It was a crisis that seemed to challenge the very faithfulness of God.
So that's the million-dollar question, right? If God promised to save Israel, but most of them aren't being saved, did God's promise fail? And Paul basically shouts from the rooftops, absolutely not. But to prove it, he has to do something totally brilliant. He has to redefine the most important word in the entire promise.
Okay, so here's our first big clue. Paul doesn't start by talking about the future. He kicks things off by basically saying, hey, you guys have been thinking about the word Israel all wrong this whole time. And boom, here it is. This one verse is literally the key that unlocks his entire argument. Now, I know, it sounds like some kind of weird riddle, right? But Paul is being incredibly precise here. He's telling us flat out that he's about to use the exact same word, Israel, to talk about two completely different groups of people. Okay, let's break this down. On one side, you've got Israel, the nation. Think of this as the ethnic, physical descendants of Abraham, what Paul calls the children according to the flesh. But Paul argues the biblical promises of salvation were never actually for this whole group. They were always aimed at the true Israel, a smaller, faithful subgroup living right in the middle of the bigger nation. So, Paul doesn't just leave it there. He gives this true Israel a special name, a name that shows up again and again in the Old Testament prophets. He calls them the remnant. And to prove he's not just making this up, Paul takes us way back to the beginning. Think about it, he says. Abraham had 8 sons, right? But the promise, it only went through one of them, Isaac. And then Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. But again, the promise only followed Jacob's line. His point is that from the very start, just being a physical descendant was never enough. The promise was always for a select, faithful few. And just to hammer the point home that this is not a new idea, Paul pulls out a quote from the prophet Isaiah. The message is clear. Even if the nation of Israel became as huge as all the sand on the seashore, God's promise to save was only ever for the remnant. Not the whole beach, just a very specific handful of sand. And you got to understand, for Paul, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. He's looking at himself and the other Jewish people who did believe in Jesus, and he's basically saying, look, it's us. We're the remnant today. The promise is happening right now, in us. This small group of saved Jews, just like it always has. Okay, now we get to the absolute climax of Paul's argument. This is where he pulls all these different threads together, the two Israels, the remnant, faith, and weaves them into this one single powerful image, the olive faith. All right, let's walk through this. First, you've got the tree itself. This tree is the community of the saved, the true Israel. Paul says that some of the natural branches, that's the unbelieving Jews, they got broken off because they didn't have faith. But then these wild olive branches, that's the believing Gentiles, non-Jews, they get grafted into that very same tree. So what you end up with is one single tree, the true Israel, that's now made up of both believing Jews and believing Gentiles. And this brings us to the most important point of the whole analogy. What gets you on the tree? It's not your bloodline. It's not your heritage. It's one thing, and one thing only, faith. If you don't believe, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Gentile, you are not on the tree. The tree is the community of believers, period. All right, so now we've got all our clues lined up. We've got the two Israels, we've got the remnant, and we've got the olive tree. We can finally circle back to that first mysterious verse and crack this case wide open.
And believe it or not, the whole solution comes down to two little words, in this way. See, a lot of people read this verse as talking about when something will happen, like, and then, at some future time, all Israel will be saved. But that's not what Paul says. He says, in this way. He's not talking about a timeline, he's talking about a method, the exact process he just showed us with the olive tree.
And I know what you might be thinking. Hang on, can he just switch up the meaning of Israel in the middle of a sentence? Well, remember clue number 1? He already did it. Back in Romans chapter 9, he said, "For they are not all Israel who are of Israel." He's already established that he uses this word in 2 different ways.
And that, my friends, brings us to the grand finale, the solution. When Paul says all Israel will be saved, he's talking about the true Israel. He means the entire olive tree, every single branch that's attached to it by faith. That's the faithful remnant of Jews and all the grafted and believing Gentiles. All of that group gets saved in this way, which is through faith in the Messiah. So when you put it all together, it completely reframes that original verse, doesn't it? It's not some far-off prediction about a mass conversion of a whole ethnic nation at the end of time. According to this reading, it's a profound statement about how salvation works right now for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, through faith. It just shows you how locking in on one little phrase can change how you see the entire picture.